the COVID-19 pandemic has affected each of our lives in so many different ways. Just thinking about the gruesome statistics, at this point, there's over 7.3 million cases that have been reported. Tragically, over 416,000 deaths around the globe as a result of this terrible virus. Now, this pandemic also poses terrible risks from a cyber security perspective with many cyber attacks. And that's really the focus that I'm going to be talking about today and kind of drawing a couple parallels there. Hackers, we know, they're targeting people's dependence on digital tools. And now, just to set the stage, as I mentioned, I want to talk a little bit about hygiene. And we're going to be contrasting both regular physical hygiene and the importance of having good hygiene with that of cyber hygiene. And that way, hopefully, we can relate to this throughout our discussion here. So again, what are some of the benefits of just good hygiene? Well, we know from a practical standpoint, it prevents diseases. We're accepted more in society. Nobody wants to be around somebody that's messy or sloppy or smelly. That's just common sense. And when we maintain our hygiene, our confidence is boosted. We have more self-esteem. We just feel good about ourselves. Good hygiene prevents poor health. It prevents pain and other ailments that many people are plagued with. Now again, now we're going to be talking about good cyber hygiene and some of the benefits that we'll see as a result. Well, from the standpoint of the coronavirus, this pandemic, it kind of disrupted all of our lives. We weren't expecting this, obviously, from a global health perspective, from an economic perspective, from a political and social systems, the disruption there. The pandemic is really spread across the globe, over 213 countries and growing, people that have suffered the virus and the consequences of it. Now, from a digital space, the unseen threat is the risk of cyber attacks. And since this pandemic has started over a couple months ago, it's grown tenfold, the cyber attacks. So that's an area I want to try to highlight a little bit. And the importance is talking about some of the cybersecurity measures that we could take right now that will help us to develop a good cyber hygiene, a good cybersecurity posture going forward. Now, I mentioned digital technology, and we think about it, we're all dependent upon digital technology, especially now more than ever. The internet is really the primary channel for human interaction. Think about that for a moment. The way that we work, the way that we hold meetings, even events such as this. It's incredible that we could be around the globe all connected through the internet. This is really the way we effectively communicate. And hopefully it won't be this way forever, but for now, it looks like the new norm. Think about, too, what else do we all communicate with? Our smartphones. Our smartphones are really one of the primary means of communicating. And what do our smartphones have on them? They're loaded with everything now. It's like a supercomputer. Our smartphones have Wi-Fi, Bluetooth low energy, RFID, near-field communication, and of course, cellular wide area network cellular capability, so we can actually talk and text and do all these amazing things to communicate with one another. Why do I mention that? From a hacker's perspective, as we turn to our smartphones and the internet, what are they doing? They're targeting wireless as a conduit to get into our smartphones, to get into our networks so they can cause problems, so they can cause havoc in our lives. And that's where we really want to be aware of. So cyber attacks, they're really preying on our reliance on these digital tools, as we mentioned, the internet, our smartphones, our laptops, our iPads, everything. And when I mention digital tools, I want you to think outside of that also, besides just physical hardware. We think about certainly the internet, but also social media. It's important to realize we're so dependent on what? Where do we go for our news? Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, video conferencing, as we're doing right now. So when we look at the world of cyber criminals, we have to realize they thrive in the digital world. This is where they excel at exploiting vulnerabilities and taking advantage of victims through cyber crime. Now, again, just to set the stage and some backstory might help you appreciate, a few years ago, myself personally and my company was targeted and was hacked repeatedly, and it was everything from my Twitter account was hacked. I received repeated DDoS attacks, which is distributed denial of service attacks, where they flood your website with repeated traffic so you can't have regular commerce and sell items on your store, which hurts a company drastically. I had $65,000 stolen from our business checking account. It became a federal investigation, lots of paperwork, lots of time, lots of energy to sort it all out, till eventually I was able to get the funds back. I even had my debit card and credit card personally and the companies targeted. And that was a real concern for me. So as the dust settled and this all unfolded, this hack, and I tried to disseminate what actually happened, one of the fears I had was the information that was compromised in my company and myself personally, where does it end up? Well, unfortunately, it ends up on the dark web. And that's important for us to understand that. And maybe just a little background on the dark web, just so we can kind of understand it a little bit for those that are not 100% familiar with it. The dark web is the internet's underbelly. We could think of it that way. It represents roughly 5% of the entire internet. So it's a small portion of it in comparison to the internet as a whole. The information is not indexed by search engines. So it's hard to find many of the sites, which we're very used to. On the surface web, we do a quick Google search, we could find sites and navigate around quickly. So to access the dark web, users use what's called the Tor. And it's really just an anonymous browser that you use, just like we might use Internet Explorer, Google Chrome, or one of those browsers. This is specifically so we can access the dark web. And the Tor browser really just routes your web page requests through a series of proxy servers. And now it's interesting, these proxy servers are really operated by volunteers around the globe, which is fascinating. And using the Tor browser and the dark web, your actual IP address is not clearly identifiable or easy to trace. And that's good for anonymity, isn't it? And the other benefit is the information is encrypted. So now let's contrast that and just think for a moment there. Maybe we could relate this to, I like to often relate it to a traditional robber. We think of a bank robber that goes into a bank, and what do they typically have? They might have a gun and they might have a mask so nobody could see their face exactly. They have their getaway car parked outside, and perhaps their voice saying, hey, give me the $10 million right now, and they got the gun to the bank attendant there. So if we think about the way a physical crime is, now let's contrast that for a moment to dark web. A cyber criminal using the dark web can remain anonymous. They're not seen. They're not heard. They're not easily traced as far as where their location is, as far as the crimes that they're committing. Their traffic, the data is encrypted. So how do you find these guys? That's what makes it so difficult, and why cyber criminals gravitate toward using the dark web as their platform to buy and sell illegal things. And that's what's actually going on there. Any of us that have read a little bit or familiar with the dark web, or even if you've been on the dark web, it is a place, unfortunately, where people can buy and sell drugs and guns and all kinds of other illicit activities there. And oftentimes, to add to the anonymity, these goods and services are paid for in cryptocurrency. And probably the most common cryptocurrency we're familiar with is Bitcoin. And what that is digital currency that allows these buyers and sellers to make transactions and yet remain anonymous. So we don't tie those Bitcoins to a particular person, giving anonymity to a cyber criminal. That's ideal for growing your empire there on the dark web. But again, we don't want to just talk all doom and gloom. How do we apply now some good cyber hygiene here so we can keep ourselves safe? Because that's really what we want to contrast this with and have something, a positive spin on it. Well, each month myself, I have my email accounts scanned to see if any of my information appears on the dark web. Now, there's a lot of credit agencies out there. They were familiar with the 4 major credit agencies throughout the U.S. And other companies, private companies as well. They provide cyber monitoring, or they often call it dark web monitoring as well. I personally work with a company called Cyberlytica. And what they do is every month they scan my email accounts and give me a report, basically. And the key is I get an alert if any of my email accounts or any of my login credentials are compromised and end up on the dark web. I'll get a report and alert from Cyberlytic, and what can I do? I can take action. That's what's the most important thing. We have the ability so we can actually respond. And the information you get in a report when you have dark web monitoring or an audit is what was compromised, when did it happen, even details about the specific breach, where your information ended up, and some positive things, action items and guidance, steps that you can take to remediate it. And for me, being proactive, if I know that my login credentials, my email was compromised in a particular breach and I get alerted to that, guess what? I'm going to log right on and I'm going to change my password immediately. So that way, nobody can take advantage and take over my account. So having a good cyber hygiene will allow you to respond when you have dark web monitoring. Important thing to keep in mind. Now, cyber criminals are targeting specific websites also that people are relying upon for information, especially during this pandemic. Health information, statistics, how healthy people are, who's sick, how many have passed away, how busy the hospitals are, where there's ventilators, where there's not, where testing can be done. So cyber criminals are taking advantage of this. They have actually targeted the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, worldometer.info, if you're familiar with that. They provide some really good coronavirus statistics. They've been targeted, the CDC, Center for Disease and Control. So many of these government agencies that provide us valuable information and news and updates and health warnings are being targeted by cyber criminals to take advantage of us. So we want to use caution. And other things too, if we think about just the internet as a whole, everything is connected to the internet. And even our critical infrastructure. To some degree, there's been reports of specific targeting to critical infrastructure. And what do we mean by that? Water plants, sewage plants, the electric grid, gas, all these different critical infrastructures can be targeted where they're sharing information over the internet. And hackers are using that, and cyber criminals are using that to exploit that with different types of attacks. And of course, sadly, healthcare providers, at a time of need when healthcare providers are trying to provide urgent care, and it could be in emergency rooms and recovery rooms, that's where cyber criminals are trying to exploit this and trying to monetize it. And it's very sad, but it is true. So everybody has to be alerted and aware so they can maintain their defenses and stay as secure as possible. Interesting, I was looking back at some research, and it was discovered back in the month of February and March as this COVID-19 started to explode. It was interesting that also registrations and website registrations were up 569%, things that were tied to these domains, tied to anything with COVID-19. And oftentimes they were used for different types of malicious attacks and exploit or dispensing malware. So a fictitious website would be set up, and it's usually a phishing attack that you would receive in your email. So, you're just receiving your email as I do every day, and now suddenly you find something, ooh, here's a supplier that has hand sanitizer, or here's somebody that has a face mask, and you're like, ooh, I can't find them at the local store. You're tempted to do what? Click on that so you can actually get it. And then oftentimes that will be a redirect that happens, and malware will be launched of different types of malware to the unsuspecting user that just clicks on that. So again, how do we stop for a moment and reflect upon this? How do we apply good cyber hygiene here? Well, I mean, the most obvious thing is don't be too quick to click. We're all, when our mind is distracted, if we're a little nervous, we have fear, we're afraid we're going to get sick, we don't have supplies, and we see an opportunity, we're very quick to click on that. Instead, if we want to go to the actual site, it's better to type in the actual browser the specific website address that we're trying to get more information on. That would be more secure than clicking in an email with a redirect. And oftentimes these offers are too good to be true. We've probably seen those. Miracle cure for coronavirus and all these other things. So if it states and it seems too good to be true, It probably isn't good and it probably isn't true. So again, don't be quick to click on there because that could be a major mistake there. Now, oftentimes we're thinking cyber criminals and we always focus in on the internet, that they're using the internet, and I mentioned wireless also to exploit different vulnerabilities and using technology in general, and that is true. But there are some examples where cyber criminals will also use hardware or other devices that may not even be as clear to us or may not be so obvious. So just as an example, smart key logger. I thought this is interesting. Imagine a cyber criminal has access to your desktop at your home, at your office, maybe you're working remote at home, and they come into your house and they simply plug in, right? Or it could even be your bank. I was at the bank recently and I noticed as I'm sitting there and the person behind their computer, I looked down toward my feet and they had a small computer there. And the back of it, all the ports were exposed and open, USB and serial, everything, full access to it. So in the case of a smart key logger, they simply plug this little black box in between what? Your computer and your keyboard. Now, if you have a little box like this hanging off the back of your computer that goes to your keyboard and it's down on the floor, you probably wouldn't even notice it. I don't even think I would notice it. The average person's not going to, or it could even be somewhat disguised. It's just very generic. It's not gonna stand out that much. But inside of this smart key logger is what? It's got a built-in Wi-Fi module. So it can actually record every single keystroke that you make on your keyboard and will wirelessly send this to the cyber criminal. That's scary. So it basically dumped everything that you typed today. Now, what do you type in over the course of a day, you may wonder? Well, a lot of things you type in. Maybe you're logging onto your bank account or stock portfolio. It could be a password. It could be your date of birth. Maybe at some point you type in your social security number, an answer to a security challenge question, whatever it is. So a keylogger like that could be used effectively against you. So again, how do we apply good cyber hygiene here? Well, we want to check anything physically. Do any cables look differently? Is there any type of thing plugged into your computer that you haven't seen before? A dongle that's hanging? Anything suspicious? Stop and inspect it and work it out to make sure that it's not something as a keylogger like this here. Another common question I always ask people from a good cyber hygiene perspective: does your computer, does your tablet, does your smartphone have a physical passcode that you have to enter in before you're using it? Or do you have at least facial recognition or biometric fingerprints, something that adds a level of security to your device? That's very important, and that's a good part of having good cyber hygiene. Now, cyber criminals, when we think about it and get into their mind, they often prey on our fear, or they prey on our uncertainty. And over the past few months, I bet all of us have had questions that have put some level of fear or uncertainty into our life. Will I lose my job? How am I going to pay my bills? What if I get sick? What if my family gets the virus? Something like that. So when our lives get turned upside down, we get distracted, cyber criminals will move in. Again, how do we apply good cyber hygiene here? Well, we have to think about using multi-factor authentication. If you're not doing it, start today. Not just for our bank or stock portfolio, but even if you're using Gmail, Yahoo Mail. Yeah, it may be free, but we want to make sure that we're using two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. And remember, people often will choose convenience over security. And that could be a mistake there. We want to be very, very careful. Another important part when we think about good cyber hygiene, do you realize that more than 50% of people reuse the same password across multiple sites? Ask yourself that question. Do you reuse the same password? Why? You shouldn't do that. Why do we do it? Because it's easy to remember. So again, what's good cyber hygiene? Create a unique password for each login. Every site you go to should have a unique login. Tough to remember these long passwords that are strong? Yeah, sure. Again, how do you improve your cyber hygiene? Use a good password manager. That can do wonders there. Very, very important. Take the time and use a good password manager. You can also improve your cyber hygiene by thinking about security challenge questions. If somebody asks you, what high school did you attend? Don't answer it honestly. Why? In 2 minutes, I could do a Google search and find out everybody's high school that they attended. Instead, use that as an opportunity to create a unique password there that only you know and only you remember. That would be very important. Now, there's been a tremendous rise in COVID-19 threats. In fact, Google just reported that cyber criminals are adapting their campaigns. The FBI just put out and issued reports, a series of alerts the past few weeks, warning businesses and the community. There's been significant increase in cyber threats. So a lot of these cyber criminals are targeting mobile apps and websites. Again, for what? Making you think about COVID-19 solutions. And all of this is used as scams or means to dispense malware. So use extra caution there. And one of the most popular ways is what? Ransomware. Different strains of ransomware that have evolved. So a good cyber hygiene, before you even fall victim of a ransomware attack, what do we want to do? Back up your data regularly, because now they're targeting healthcare institutions, government agencies, and it's very, very important that we're careful there and back up our data. So the likelihood of cyber attacks will grow as we hear about these grim statistics growing, and those that keep getting this virus, unfortunately. But by practicing good hygiene, we'll stay healthy, we'll feel better. And the same is true if we implement good cyber hygiene. We can effectively embrace digital technology and the internet for good and fight back against cyber criminals.